Okay, now, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to all about container gardening program that is presented by Lynn Laurie from K-State Extension for Wyandotte County. And Lynn is horticulture agent that will lead us in this presentation. There are two things that I want to mention. First of all, this program is going to be recorded, but do not worry, your pictures will not appear on the recording. And second, that I posted in the chat the link to library market calendar, right where you signed up for this program. It has two files for you to download, vegetable gardening in pots and growing flowers in pots. So if you click on the chat, you will see the link. Click on the link, it will take you to the library calendar. And on the right side, you will see two files that you will need to download. Okay, well, Lynn, the scene is all yours.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. I am Lynn Lowry, and I am the Wyandotte County Horticulture Agent. And for those of you who are not familiar, every county has an extension office, whether it be Missouri or Kansas. And so we are located just off of State Avenue near the old Kmart. So we are open to walk-ins, phone calls, if you have gardening questions, lawn questions, outdoor insects, that's what I'm here for. In our office, we also have 4-H, we have food and nutrition, and community vitality folks. So we offer other services as well. We also do soil testing here as well as radon kits. So please check us out. Today I am going to talk about container gardening, and it's mainly for people that, number one, don't have a very good spot for an in-ground bed of flowers or vegetables, whether that be the yard is too small or the ground is not conducive to growing, or maybe it's too shady. So we're going to talk about first flowers, and then we'll move into vegetables. So if you have questions, please drop those in the chat, and we'll try to monitor those and probably answer them at the end unless something's really, really pressing. So with that said, I'm going to turn my video off so that you pay attention to the slides and the information being covered versus what quirky habits I have as a speaker. So let me do that, if I can figure this out. All right, so let's get going. So the first thing I would say is container gardening really opens up lots and lots of possibilities for folks that maybe, like I said, don't have a large yard, they don't have good soil or too shady of an area, or let's say they entertain a lot and maybe they want to swap out their containers to change the atmosphere. Or many of you may have already planted your vegetables. And guess what? At my house last night, we got down to 28 degrees, which will do damage to vegetable plants, particularly tomatoes and peppers that really shouldn't be planted until Mother's Day. So with plants in a container, you can pick those pots up, put them in a garage or a sheltered area, and you can avoid the freeze or frost. So containers also allow people that have maybe a bad back, arthritis, can't bend over, can't get down on their knees. You can grow in boxes that are up off the ground. You can grow in pots that you buy at any large box store or Kmart, Walmart. So it allows flexibility for the gardener. And that's the most important thing. There are several challenges. So I don't want to be all rose-colored glasses when we do have some challenges. And that is, number one, you have all sides of that container exposed to the environment. When you grow plants in the ground is an insulation for the roots. But when you have pots, that means those pots heat up faster, they cool down faster. because there's more exposure to the environment. Of course, the larger the pot or container, the least stress. Number one, it'll hold and retain water longer in a larger pot. But just be known that the other thing that's kind of tricky is we're not growing in soil. We are growing in soilless mixes, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But that means you have to be more attentive to watering and fertilizing these plants than you would in the ground. Our soils are naturally high in nutrients. And when we don't grow in soil, these soilless mixes require regular fertilizing. So you just can't plant and walk away. There is a little more difficulty when you grow in containers. It doesn't matter what kind of container, but I will say this, find what works for you and stick to it. So if you look at the upper right-hand corner, those are clay pots, very porous. In other words, they breathe. Water and air move through the holes in those containers. You don't see it, but it happens. So evaporation is quicker. If you look at the bottom right-hand corner, those are ceramic pots. They have a glaze on the outside, giving that beautiful blue color. That impedes the flow of moisture and air through that pot. So that pot is going to dry out a lot slower than the upper right-hand corner. If you grow hanging baskets and they sell that looks like netting, or it looks like sphagnum peat moss, that is really porous and that dries out really quickly. Matter of fact, that material will wick the moisture away from the soil that the plant's growing into. So again, a lot higher maintenance depending on what type of pot you select. The other thing I would say is you need to select a container that fits the size of the plant. So if you're growing a house plant in your home, you probably don't need a very big container unless you're growing a ficus or a bigger house plant. The bigger the top growth, the bigger the pot, the bigger the root system. Outside, a pansy is going to need a very small container versus, say, a lantana or a plant that gets a bigger root system. Same with vegetables. A pepper plant is going to need a smaller pot than a tomato plant. So keep that in mind, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. Containers can be fun, but you need to understand how the air and water moves through that container. So you can use an old wash tub. You can use a pair of jeans, and they've stuffed that full of other shirt material to make it stand up. But you will notice that there's a cactus growing in that, because that is a very difficult pot to water and keep water in it. So we put plant materials that don't require a lot of water in a situation like that. You can see an old wheelbarrow that's probably seen better days. And most of the time our wheelbarrows will rot out in the middle. So you have automatic holes in the bottom of that container. On the lower right, you have some chairs. So you can get really creative. And in the seat of the chairs, they have put a hanging basket and then planted, in this case, a lot of coleus. So planters can be really unique, don't have to be boring. I prefer the boring ones because they're easier to manage. So the first thing we're going to do, regardless of the container, you're going to make sure it has drainage holes in the bottom of it. If it does not, you are going to want to drill or poke holes in the bottom of that container so that water can drain out. They have some beautiful pots on the market with no drain holes. The way you can handle that is you can put a pot inside of that pot that does have drain holes. And when you water, you will empty the pot without the holes from time to time so that the plant does not set in water. So drain holes are a must, and I can't emphasize that enough. Let's talk about potting mixes. When you grow in containers, we recommend a soilless mix. So when you go buy your potting soil, it will say on it, potting soil or containers. And that's what you want to purchase. Those bags contain a mixture of peat moss, vermiculite, sometimes bark, sometimes perlite, and they're real light and airy. The whole reason they're designed is for proper drainage, so water does not sit in the soil, and also to allow for nutrients for the plants to pick up. So they hold on to water and nutrients, but they also allow it to drain away. So you have an ideal situation. We do not use soil from the lawn or garden. And the reason we don't is because our soils contain lots of natural insects, millipedes, centipedes, grubs, earthworms, and also weed seed. So weeds blow into our soil, and the last thing we want in our containers is a bunch of weeds. The other thing is our soils in Kansas City area are very high in clay content. That means they're very heavy and they do not drain well. They may also contain disease organisms. So it's best when you're growing in containers to buy the soilless potting mix at the store. The other thing that people do incorrectly is they tend to put rocks or pebbles in the bottom of the container. They think that assists in drainage. It does the exact opposite. It tightly holds on to the water and causes a wet zone between the soil and the bottom of the container. So if you're worried about the soil going out the bottom holes, just use a coffee filter. Put that in the bottom of your pot. That will allow water to go out through the holes in the bottom, but it will keep the soil in place in the container. Very simple solution. That filter will break down in time once the roots start growing in the pot, and then the soil won't move out through the bottom of the holes. Let's talk about the location of the container. So you've picked the container, you've filled it full of soil. Now we need to decide, where am I going to put that? Now you'll notice we haven't bought one plant yet. We're not ready to buy plants until we've done these steps. So do you have a sunny location? Do you have a shady location? Where are the pots going to be? Then you purchase the plant based on the sun exposure that this pot will sit in. For vegetables, they all require full sun. You might get by with growing lettuce in a part shade situation, but most vegetables require full sun. I mean 6 to 8 hours of sun. Flowers, on the other hand, there are sun-loving and there are shade-loving plants, and I've listed a few of each that you could select from. The other thing to consider is the location sheltered or exposed. In other words, how much wind is that pot going to have to sustain? If you look at the picture on the right, those are very large leaf plants in that one container. If that were at my house, I get western winds that howl through my yard. Those leaves would be tattered. So I don't grow any large leafed plants in the front of my house. Now, if I grow on my back patio, that's a sheltered location, but it's also a location that only gets morning sun. So that wouldn't be a good place to put lantana, a plant that loves hot, dry, as much sun as you can give it. But that might be an excellent place to put some of these sun coleus that will tolerate sun, but prefer to not have the hot afternoon sun. So again, we need to understand what kind of sun and wind exposure we have, and then we buy the plants accordingly. Let's talk about flowers first. When I come up with a planter or a container of flowers, I look at texture, I look at colors, I look at shapes and forms, and I look at heights. And I want that container to be as striking as possible. I even spend a lot of time deciding what color I want my container, because the color, the texture of the container adds to the beauty as well. So you've got a hanging basket of petunias. That's kind of boring, but that's a standard hanging basket. Now, we'll talk about hanging baskets here in a few minutes. On the bottom, we have a water trough that a lot of farmers buy for their livestock. These have been drilled full of holes, and you'll see at the base of those containers, water oozing out. Again, all containers, I don't care what kind, need to have holes drilled in the bottom. The bottom container has lantana and creeping jenny. These are plants that love heat and they love sun. So a great plant for this type of container. Sometimes these metal containers will really get hot when the sun beats down on them. And you have to remember, when that's happening, what are those roots doing in that soil? Are they cooking as well? So you want to pick plants that are going to tolerate that hot condition. You also want to pick plants that like the same growing requirements, the same light exposure, the same water needs. So you wouldn't want to put a cactus in the bottom picture, because lantana and creeping jenny like it hot, but they also need water, much more so than a cactus. So you need to think about the water requirements of the plant. When we grow containers, there's an old saying that you need to have plants that grow upright, give it height, give it dimension. Then you want some trailing plants, and then you want filler plants. Filler plants are what we commonly think of as our typical petunias, geraniums, caladiums, those kinds of things. The verticals give you height. This can be dracaenas, this can be millets, this can be ornamental grasses, something that's going to stick out of the pot 2 to 3 feet. And then you want something to hang down over the pot, which trails, like sweet potato vines, licorice vine. This lower one is the variegated vinca vine. But you don't want so many plants in the pot so that they outcompete with one another. So again, a lot of this is trial and error and what will work for you. The pot on the bottom is one of my pots. It's a minimum of a 24-inch pot, minimum. And I probably have in that pot 4 plants. So in the middle, I have the dracaena, that's this right here. Then I have my geraniums, and I have 3 of those, or 2 or 3, I can't remember. And then I have, believe it or not, just 1 variegated vinca vine. And this is probably in late July, this photo. But if you put too many plants in, they're going to outcompete with one another, and they're not going to bloom very well for you. So just keep that in mind. When we typically go to a nursery and we buy hanging baskets, they are glorious. They'll have so many plants in it. They sell really well because they're glorious. But in 2 months, those plants start looking really raggedy because there's too many plants in that hanging basket. So again, know what you're going to plant, know how big they are going to get at maturity, and then buy the number of plants you need. If you start seeing your plants competing with one another, go ahead and remove 1 or 2 of them, because the overall effect you want is a good, healthy, flowering container that flowers throughout the summer. The other thing to consider is complementary colors. And I've just given some examples. Purple and yellow go well together. They give you that, wow, isn't that beautiful? Blues and orange go well together, red and green. So there's the color wheel. Any of you that are artists will know what I'm talking about. I'm not an artist, but I do know that I like certain colors together, and usually it complies with the color well. But again, you want that container to be really impactful and to draw people's attention to it. A lot of people like to entertain at night on their patios. You might want to consider silvers, whites, that spectrum of color, because those really stick out in the evening. During the day, you want to go with your hot colors, your reds, your yellows, your oranges. Those are really powerful. If you want a soothing container, then you want to stick with your blues and your light blues and your whites. So flowers can set a mood for you. And the color wheel is alive and well when you're selecting plants. Let's talk about hanging baskets. Originally, they were designed to hang from trees. Like I've got a picture over here. These are begonias. Most trees provide shade, so most of the hanging baskets way back in the day were shade-loving plants. Well, now we know we can hang baskets anywhere. We can put a hook into a structure. But let me tell you one thing, and we're going to get to this, and I'm going to say it again. When you use a hanging basket, please, please, please hang it so it hangs low enough that you look at the flowers and not the bottom of the basket. That's the number one problem I see people do. They look great from afar, but if you're on a patio looking at them, all you see is the bottom of the container. And that's not really giving you the benefit of the flowers in the container. The larger the basket size, the happier your plants are going to be. Sutherland's, and I don't mean to knock anybody, but I will them because I get the most calls. They'll have their 10-inch baskets on sale any day now, and they will be like $5. Well, those are really attractive until we get into July, and then there's just not enough soil volume to hold the amount of moisture to make those plants happy. So the larger the basket, a minimum is 14 to 16 inches, is necessary to make those plant roots happy and to be able to apply enough fertilizer and water to have a quality, beautiful plant. They will dry out quickly because they are exposed on all sides of the container and often up above where they're exposed to winds. You may even need to remove the baskets during high winds like we've had the past few days. So here's what I mean. If you look at this picture over here on the right, it's a beautiful basket, but all the person standing down here is going to see is the sweet potato vine, okay? So maybe on the left, this is a better idea. This is a shepherd hook with 2 hooks, and they have hung the baskets there. So when you walk into those, you don't even see the container. You see nothing but flowers. So keep that in mind as you're using hanging baskets, because there's no sense in paying all that money for flowers when all you're going to look at is the basket. Let's switch to veggies. There is a huge fad going on right now that everybody wants to grow vegetables. And that's a great thing, because vegetables, there's nothing like homegrown vegetables, being able to go out and harvest as you see fit and eat them fresh. Very nutritious. So we're going to spend a little time talking about growing vegetables in containers. About 8 years ago, I started growing vegetables in containers for this presentation. I wanted to prove to myself that you could grow just about anything in containers. And so over the past 8 years, I've been doing that. Now there are some caveats. Number one, you have to select different varieties that do well in containers. And the handout that is available will talk about vegetable varieties. It won't be all encompassing, but it'll have a good selection. But you want to grow varieties that are somewhat compact in their growth. So heirloom tomatoes, Heirloom tomatoes can get 6 to 8 foot tall. You do not want to grow those in your standard container. They may do really well in that horse tank that we looked at, but they will not do well in my 24-inch pot because there'll be too much top growth and they'll constantly want to flip over the container. They'll be too top heavy. Plus, you need more root area for that leggy of a plant. But I have grown lettuce, onions, cabbage, kale, broccoli, beets, carrots, tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, potatoes, all kinds of herbs, and I've been very successful. Okay. I will say though, when I'm growing my tomatoes, I try to get 36-inch minimum containers. Again, because even the smaller varieties, or what we call determinate varieties. Determinate means that the plant will only grow to a certain size, and it will usually have one big flush of tomatoes versus an heirloom, which is considered indeterminate, meaning it'll grow until it freezes. It will also produce fruit until it freezes. So when you grow in containers, it's better to buy determinate varieties, okay? I even grow cherry tomatoes in my containers and will have all the tomatoes I ever need from one plant. So in the bottom left down here, I even know people, I have not done this, will grow lettuce and spinach in clear tubs. They don't really even have to be clear tubs. In this case, probably because the tub's only about half full with potting mix. They seeded the lettuce seeds, and then here's what they got, and they can go out and harvest lettuce for lunch if they want and make a salad. Herbs can be grown this way too. Most of these plants have fairly shallow root systems, so they don't need a very deep container. Onions is another example that could be grown in a shallow container because their root system is not very deep. We have eggplant over here that is grown in probably a 12-inch pot. Again, I only have one plant in the container. Up above, you see I'm growing broccoli and 2 different cabbages, and I've stuck in green onions around cabbage. So this is probably a month after they've been planted. And I'll have some more pictures coming up of how they've grown over time. So here are some basic guidelines on container size. If the container is less than or equal to 1 gallon, you can grow small vegetables like the herbs, the onions, the carrots, the beets. You can buy carrots that are little round carrots that aren't what you buy at the grocery store that are 4 and 5 inches long. So you can buy a shorter growing carrots, and that's what I would recommend for that size of pot. 1 to 3 gallon pots, you can put peppers, cabbage, cauliflower. And again, my pots are about 24 inches. They'll hold about 2 gallons of soil. And I've grown everything in that size except for tomatoes. I've grown potatoes, sweet potatoes, peppers, you name it. When we talk tomatoes and say you want to grow, I don't know, pumpkins, I would say get a bigger than 3 gallon container. That might be where I look at that water trough that we have for our animals, or you can buy huge pots. You just pay more. Okay, so let's talk about vegetables because there's a lot of confusion about what do I plant when. And so I'm going to try to straighten that out right now. Cool season, meaning they grow well in the spring or fall. And then we'll talk about warm season. And I don't recommend planting warm season until after Mother's Day. And everybody goes, oh, I always put my stuff in the ground the end of April. Well, guys, we have had snowflakes the 1st of May, which means those warm season vegetables are not going to be happy. So it's better to just wait, because if you plant them too soon, they're not going to grow anyway. They're just going to sit there in the pot or in the ground, and wait for the soil temperatures to increase to above 55 degrees. Now you heard what I said, didn't you? Soil temperature. It's not the air temperature that we're talking about, it's the soil temperature. And yes, in containers, our soils do heat up quicker than growing in the ground. So let's talk about cool season first. That's the lettuce, the radish, the spinach, potatoes, onions, peas, carrots, cabbage. And asparagus is a perennial, but it's the first crop we harvest, and we're harvesting right now. So these prefer cool soil temperatures, okay? Not real cold, somewhere in the 45, 50, 55 degree range. And lettuce probably will tolerate quite a bit of freeze damage. So will spinach. But some of these others don't want to be a hard frost. When I talk a hard frost, I'm talking 28 degrees for 3 hours. So last night it got to 28 degrees at my house, but it was only 28 degrees for about 20 minutes. That probably wasn't cold enough to do a lot of damage. But every area is different. On the south side of my house, it was 32 degrees. So again, you need to understand your yard and where you have some protected areas and where you have some exposed areas, and then understand how that affects your plants. Potatoes, we typically plant St. Patty's Day, which is mid-March. These other cool season vegetables, I'm going to even break that down further for you here in the next slide. On the warm season crops on the right, sweet potatoes actually you can't even find slips until mid to late May. So sweet potatoes really require warm soils or they will be happy. A lot of people have already planted their tomatoes and they're going to struggle. They're going to sit there. Their roots are not going to grow. They may look okay, but believe me, they will not be happy. Peppers require even warmer soils than tomatoes. Same with cucumbers and any of your melon plants. So let's talk about season vegetables and break it down a little further. On the first column, these crops should be planted in mid-March to late March. So you can all read and see, but your cold crops, that's these guys right here, broccoli, cabbage, and cauliflower, okay? These take a long time to develop, so that's why we plant them early. And of course, potatoes, St. Patty's Day, we generally harvest those around July the 4th. Now, the reason we plant these crops in mid-March is they will, what we call bolt. They will send up a flower stalk once the air temperature gets really warm. So about mid-May, they're going to start sending that flower stalk up. And then basically you don't have anything to harvest. And so broccoli will get these little yellow to white flowers. Cabbage will get the same thing. And at that point, your crop is done. Now, April, we would plant beets, carrots, chard, collards. We can plant another crop of lettuce and onions and spinach. Some people will actually plant spinach in the fall of the year. They'll cover it up with leaves throughout the winter months. And then as soon as it starts to warm up, they'll remove those leaves and they'll have early spinach. Spinach is a lot sweeter when you harvest it early in the spring. A lot of these crops will start getting a little bitter when it starts getting too warm for them. Let's talk about fall. We talked about these same crops being planted in the fall. And I'd like to say we need to cross out the word fall because when we're really planting these is in the summer. And people wait too long and they start planting these in September because that's what fall means to them. To be successful, you really need to start planting in mid-July. And guess what? It's hotter than Hades. It's windy. And the last thing people want to do is go out and till the soil and plant. Beans, they're the one crop, the warm season crop, that can be planted every 30 days so that you have constant supply of beans throughout the summer. The last time you would plant would be mid-July, your last bean crop, because once the days shorten and the temperatures drop, they stop producing. Broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower do really well in the fall, but you have to start planting them in mid-July. We usually buy transplants, little plants of these. The number one problem with a fall vegetable crop is finding a supply of the plants. It's just not that popular. So nurseries and garden centers oftentimes do not have these plants available. So you would have to start these from seed, which takes longer. Potatoes, you can have a fall crop of potatoes, but again, can you find seed potatoes? And guess what? You can't just use the potatoes out of the sack you buy at the grocery store, because they have a sprout inhibitor on those. And that's what causes the potato to grow, are those sprouts. So if you are lucky, you might be able to mail order some seed potatoes for that mid-July planting. In August, we would plant kale, lettuce, radish, spinach, and turnips, and we would do that from seed. Again, you have to pay particular attention to keeping the soil moist to get them to germinate. You may even need to shade that area with a row cover or some kind of structure so that they don't dry out until they germinate. So fall planting can be kind of tedious. The reason we have to start so early in the summer months is every crop and variety has a days to maturity. That means days to having an ample crop to harvest. And so when you go to buy seeds or plants, you want to pay attention to that days to maturity and then back up. So let's say we have a freeze November 5th. You would want to have that as your end date, November 5th. And then if it says it's 30 days to maturity, that means the latest you could plant would be October 30th, or I'm sorry, probably October 5th. So does that make sense? So keep that in mind. Otherwise, you will run out of days for that plant to reach maturity or reach the point where the fruit is edible. Okay, so all varieties of plants have different days to maturity. So in Kansas, we would buy a broccoli or cauliflower plant variety that had the shortest days to maturity if we're planting it in the spring or fall. Reason it's important in the spring is we don't want it to get too hot on us. And then that plant decide to send up a flower stalk and flower. So pay attention to that. If we were in an area that had a longer growing season, like let's say we lived in Wichita, their season in Wichita is probably 2 weeks longer than ours. They could probably start their spring crops 2 weeks earlier than we could. They could also start their fall crop 2 weeks later because their season is longer. I hope that clears up maybe some confusion. Now I'm going to leave these slides up a little for you so you can write down some of these varieties. K-State has done research over the years on different varieties that do well in this area. And the state of Kansas and Missouri can be really tough in growing plants. We're in what's called the transition area, meaning we have these freak freezes. I think last year on April 17th, we had 3 inches of snow. And they're still predicting that we can maybe see some flurries on Easter. So we have bizarre weather. it's very hot and windy. It can also be very cold and dry. So we have to do research on different varieties to find out what does well for us. And so these are just a few examples of varieties that you can find that have short days to maturity and that will also do well in containers. Okay, and there's just some pictures down below of some of the lettuces. Beets, and some of these will do well in the ground as well. So don't just think these are only for containers. So Detroit dark red beets, those are really popular, whether they're in the ground or in a container. And I'm giving you some spacing. So what you'll see is 3-inch spacing, depending on how many you're going to put in your container size is the most limiting factor. Again, if we're growing in that big water trough, we can grow a lot of these plants in that big container. But if we have a 24-inch pot, we're going to be lucky to grow 4 or 5 plants in that container. So again, I'll give you a little bit of time to look over the list so you can jot down some of these varieties. Onions, I will say this, you can grow a heck of a lot of green onions. And you know the difference, don't you, between a green onion, like that people call scallions as well, or the big bulb onion, like the ones you buy at the store that are yellow or white onions or sweet onions. It's just when you harvest. The green onions you harvest when they have been in the ground for about a month. The bigger onions, you're letting those go until probably July or August. So in containers, the green onions or the scallions are the easiest to grow in those containers. And remember, onions have a very shallow root system. So they need watered and fertilized more frequently than most other crops that you're going to plant. Broccoli, again, these are my crops that I have grown in containers. And you can see that my broccoli is doing pretty well. It's not quite ready to harvest. And that happens to be Pac-Man is what I was growing in my container. On the right, the eggplant has done really well. The one you're looking at is actually neither one of these. It's the old standard eggplant, Black Beauty. And you'll also notice something, any of you that grow eggplant, usually the leaves on the eggplant are full of holes because of insects. Well, in containers, sometimes you can trick the insects. Sometimes they won't find your plants as easily. Mine are growing on a patio, a brick patio. And so I have very little insect problems on my patio. Now, plants that I grow in the front of the house, I tend to have a little more insect damage. And I'm going to guess it's because that area of the house is warmer and there's more prevailing winds, which tends to blow the insects in. At least that's what I'm assuming is happening. Herbs. Now, this isn't a planted container. This is where the herbs are in individual containers, just to kind of prove my point. If I were going to grow these herbs in this size of container, I would grow no more than 2 because those herbs need room for the roots. But a lot of people will try to grow herbs in their windowsill, in their kitchen, and that can be really tricky because some of these require lots and lots and lots of sunshine. And even in a south or west window in our homes, it's almost like a part shade situation outside. So if you're trying to grow herbs inside, it's really tough during the summer months. You can keep them alive, but are they going to be very productive? No. So this is a great place for a container just outside your kitchen door. Hopefully you have enough sun. Some of the herbs require less sun than others. Mint, you'll see mint over there on the right. This baby should be in its own container. Mints are very, 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 very aggressive. And I would never suggest growing mints in the ground because they will take over. In a container, you can keep them contained and from taking over. So containers, if you grow mint, they're almost a must. Okay, so I'm going to throw some more pictures at you. This is onions and a cabbage plant in my 24-inch container at planting. So boy, don't they look sickly. These onions, I'm like, are they going to make it? You can see my soil has a lot of peat moss. It has perlite. That's what these little white things are. It also has vermiculite in it, which is kind of a gray looking stuff. It's kind of puffy. That's what my container mix is. This picture below is about 3 weeks later. So you can see how it's taken off. The onions are starting to look really well. In about another week, I would harvest these onions for green onions. This is my cauliflower. You can see I also have onions around it. And this is ready to harvest. You can see I have a little bit of looper damage, which is a caterpillar, but not enough that I care about. So I'll let them be happy and I'll be happy. There's enough for all of us. When we talk about tomatoes, this bottom picture is a determinate variety. So yes, it still gets tall. There is a stake in here that you can't see that I've got the plant tied up to. This is a 36-inch container and it's adequate for this variety. This up here is Tumbling Tom, which you can see very productive cherry, big cherry tomato. It's only in about an 18-inch container and it's adequate. It's called determinate growth, meaning it's not going to get any taller than this. So you can see the difference. Like I said, heirloom varieties tend to get twice this tall. And then you have a problem with keeping the pot from tipping over. And you don't really have enough root area for the plant to be healthy. Peppers can be grown in about any size pot, 12-inch up to 24-inch. Most pepper plants are easily contained in that. They love the heat, so they do really well in containers. I've grown just about every kind of pepper in pots and have been really happy with them. You don't see varieties listed here because almost any variety will do well in a container. Irish potatoes. Yes, I decided I really needed to try this. So basically, if you can follow along with me, the first photo is my 24-inch container. It's filled half full potting mix. And there's my seed source. It's a potato that's been cut into fours that has eyes on it. And it's planted, covered up. I let it grow. When it starts producing foliage, I add more soil. And I keep doing that until I'm about 1 inch from the lip of the container. Because if you know anything about potatoes, they are not a root. They're a tuber. They're a modified stem. Here are the roots on a potato. So the tubers form on the stem. They are a modified stem, and that's why you keep adding soil as foliage grows. So this shows about the end of June. This was harvested July 4th. And you can see that little bitty piece of potato became very productive. Now, the one thing I will tell you, the texture of the potato skin is odd. It's kind of spongy. Nothing wrong with it. It still tastes good. The texture is different because of the texture of the soil. So people kind of freak out about that, but we're all edible. Sweet potatoes is the same thing. You put a slip, and a slip is a vegetative part of the plant. In the pot, only one slip, my 24-inch pot. You can see that you have to have room for the vine, and then when you dig it, this is what I came up with. Again, the shape of the sweet potato is a little odd. It's more elongated than typical, and it's probably because the soil is so much looser than if it were growing in the ground. Again, these were edible, very delicious. So again, you can grow some odd things in pots. You can also grow strawberries. They have these strawberry containers so that you can put plants in each of these little pockets. To me, it's kind of a novelty. If I'm serious about growing strawberries, I would not do this. Keeping these little areas of soil wet is almost impossible in July and August. So yeah, it's cool looking, but is it very practical? No. So again, when we're thinking about pots, think about the root system, think about the amount of soil, think about how frequently you're going to water it, how frequently you're going to fertilize it. You want to always water so water comes out the bottoms of the hole, and then you use your finger to make sure that the soil is not totally dry, but that's the number one indicator is your finger and the moisture in the soil. Always water thoroughly, meaning you cannot give too much water at any one time. The secret is letting the soil dry out in between waterings. Fertilizing quickly, you want to use a water-soluble fertilizer. I recommend that you cut the rate into 1/4 what it says on the container, and you water every week or every other week, because plants will need lots of fertilizer, especially your vegetables and annual flowers. Sometimes there are time release fertilizers already in the soil. You can expect about 1/3 of the amount of time they say on the bag. So if it says it'll last for 3 months, you can figure on about a month. Reason for that is those fertilizer pellets have been in that soil for months before you buy it. And every time the temperature warms up, they degrade. So by the time you buy it and use it, part of that fertilizer has already been lost out of the soil. And last but not least, pests. You're going to have to monitor your plants in those containers and diagnose problems and then treat like you would if you were growing these plants in the ground. So with that, I think I've used up my hour. So this is my contact information. You're always welcome to reach out to me, and I'll be glad to help in any way that I can. Are there any questions?
Yes, there was a question about, let me see. Can these tips for growing veggies in containers also apply to raised garden beds?
You know, it's a little different. Raised garden beds typically are much deeper. Typically, we use the soil from the garden. So it's just a little different ball game. You have usually a larger growing area, so you won't need to water as frequently. If you're growing in actual soil, you won't need near the fertilizer you would in containers, because remember, containers don't have soil. So it's a little different, and that's why I separate the two.
Everybody is thanking you for the great program.
Great.
And it's lunchtime, so lots of people have to hop off. So, and thank you. It's been wonderful. It's been so informative.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, and look me up if you have any questions.
I'm wondering if we can get a PowerPoint or slides of this presentation.
We can talk after.
Okay. But definitely this will be posted on our programming blog, and I posted the URL in our chat session so that people can go after tomorrow and watch again this program in the recording.
Thank you.
Here's a couple more. Let's see. Yeah, thank you very much for the information. Will they have free plant starters? Will they have free plant starters? I believe this question to the extension, right? If the extension will have free plant starters.
We actually have a plant sale coming up that will be the end of this month on Friday and Saturday, but unfortunately, nothing will be free. We have to raise our own money for the programs we do in the county. And so it's a fundraiser for my master gardeners to do programming with youth and to have demonstration gardens in the county. So look us up and we will have great varieties of vegetables. We'll have annual flowers and perennial flowers as well. So good opportunity to put a plug in for us.
And once again, where is this going to be? What's the address?
It's at our office, which is just off 79th and State Avenue. We look into the side of the old Kmart or what was recently the COVID Center.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes, and the question is, on what day are you going to have your sale?
It would be on the 29th and 30th, I believe. That's the Friday, Saturday, the last Friday and Saturday in April.
Sale.
You can visit our website to get more specifics on that.
And the website is ksu.edu, correct?
You would probably go to Wyandotte County and just put Wyandotte County Extension and Google that and it'll come up.
Okay, well, thank you very much again, everybody, for participation, and huge thank you to Lynn for doing this program for us. And would be nice to hear how people actually implemented this knowledge and how they managed to grow their vegetables and flowers. So let's keep in contact and let's see how we use the knowledge.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much, and everybody have a great day. Thank you.